Why did you write this book?
My father is a black African, was a black African. My mother is a white American. He came to the States to study right after independence of Kenya and was part of that first wave of Africans to travel to the West in search of knowledge to bring back to post-independence Africa. My mother came from small towns in Kansas, and my grandfather on my mother's side was a traveling salesman for a long time. And so they came from very different backgrounds. They came together during the Civil Rights Movement. Although they weren't active, I think they were swept up in the spirit of integrationist America and the dream of Dr. King and the optimism and idealism of the Kennedys, and ended up separating shortly thereafter. And so the book is really me trying to understand what their lives were about, and thereby understand what my life is about.
This is not the kind of book you originally set out to write, though.
No. I originally got the idea of writing a book while I was at Harvard Law School, where I served as the president of the Law Review. And in listening to a number of the debates going back and forth about affirmative action and voting rights and all the controversies surrounding race issues in the country, I thought that I might be able to insert myself into the debate and hopefully clarify it. What I realized, though, was that the starting point for any insights I might have really had to do with the story of my own family and coming to terms with that multicultural heritage. And so the first book, at least, that I needed to write was a book that came to terms with that divided heritage. Is
it then an oversimplification to say you had to get your own house in order in your mind before you could work on the country's?
Well, I certainly think that you have to know where you've been if you want to know where you're going. And for someone who comes out of a family and a background that's both black and white, that's a especially important process that one has to go through. We live in a land of strangers. Blacks and whites don't know each other. They don't know their stories very well. Within my own family, even in the best meaning family, there's a tremendous scope for misunderstanding, for suspicion, for fear. And until I understood what those fears were, what those hopes were, and what those dreams were, I think I was destined to potentially at least repeat some of the mistakes that my parents and grandparents had made.
All of that 30 years after Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, this seems almost incredible to me at times to think that in 30 years, this is all the progress we've been able to make.
Well, it is frustrating. I think I talk a lot about in the book my attempts to renew the dream that both of my parents had. I worked as a community organizer in Chicago, was very active in low-income neighborhoods, working on issues of crime and education and employment, and seeing that in some ways certain portions of the African American community are doing as bad, if not worse, and recognizing that my fate remained tied up with their fates, that my individual salvation is not going to come about without a collective salvation for the country. Unfortunately, I think that recognition requires that we make sacrifices, and this country has not always been willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary to bring about a new day and a new age.
Would this book properly be called an autobiography, though?
Well, I have not been completely comfortable with calling it an autobiography. I get the image when I talk about autobiographies of famous generals writing about their war exploits or movie stars talking about their love interests. Obviously, at the age of 33, when I finished writing it, I just turned 34. My experiences are only part of my life, and I haven't achieved any closure yet, hopefully. But what I would describe it as is more of a family history. I think it's an oral history, a narrative of a family trying to understand itself, and me as a African and an American trying to understand my place in a divided society.
What was the most difficult part of the book to write?
I think what was toughest was writing honestly and truthfully about the suspicions and hurts and failings of the people closest to me, and writing about those same failings and disappointments and blind spots in myself. I think whenever we talk about race, there are all kinds of issues that we'd like to skirt. I tell a story just to take one of the clearest examples of my grandmother, who loves me dearly and has made all kinds of sacrifices on my behalf, expressing at one point when I was a teenager her fear of black men on the streets. And to discuss that honestly and to discuss how that felt, to discuss how my grandmother felt, and then to be able to arrive at some sort of peace with that, some greater understanding and some forgiveness, I think was probably the most difficult part of writing it.
Were there times when you felt like just backing away from the whole thing and saying, I don't think I can go through with this?
Right. Well, certainly I think there's an impulse among all of us to shy away from these issues. There's a certain race weariness that confronts the country, precisely because the questions are so deeply embedded, and the solutions are going to require so much investment of time, energy, and money. And so I share that reluctance sometimes to explore these issues. I think what kept me going is the recognition that we can't solve these problems by ignoring them or pretending that they don't exist. And one of the things that strikes me in the country right now is our tendency to either pretend that racial conflict does not exist, that racial division and hatred does not exist, and to pretend that we live in a colorblind society. I think sometimes members of the Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court, take that line. Or to say that race is everything, that there's no possibility of common ground between black and white. And I think the truth of the matter is that, and hopefully what people will get out of the book is some sense that although the lives of blacks and whites in this country are different, although our historical experiences are different, my family is an example, and hopefully I am an example of the possibility of arriving at some common ground, and that we do share values and principles around which we can organize and make for a better life.
What did it feel like to be in Africa and actually walk the land your father walked?
Well, it was a wonderful experience in some ways. I think it was also a sobering experience in a lot of ways. I did not know my father well growing up. My return to Africa sort of served as a dual function. Part of it was a very personal journey to piece together my father's story and figure out who he was. Part of it was a journey that I think a lot of African Americans think about making and sometimes actually make, to return to the motherland, so to speak, and to understand what our roots are. In this trip, I end up combining both those things. And I think what I experienced was, on the one hand, the joy of connecting with a part of myself that I wasn't as familiar with as I needed to be. At the same time, I think it also dispelled a lot of myths and idealization of Africa that I think is important these days. And because I think of the problems that African Americans face in this country, we tend to have a sanitized view in the African American community about what is going on in Africa. And the truth of the matter is that many of the problems that Africa faces, whether it's poverty or political suppression or ethnic conflict, is just as prominent there and can't all be blamed on the effects of colonialism. What it can be blamed on is some of the common factors that affect Bosnia or Los Angeles or all kinds of places on this earth, and that is the tendency for one group to try to suppress another group in the interest of power or greed or resources or what have you.
Well, in the end, has doing this book helped you sort through those larger issues with any greater ease?
Well, I think the book, to some degree, was cathartic. I think what it did was to help me reclaim both sides of my heritage, help me to understand that I think most of my life had been and has been spent in pursuit of values and principles that I can live by as an individual, and that I think all groups can share. And I think the element of forgiveness was also important. I think it was important for me to understand that the forces that shaped my father were not so different from the forces that had shaped me, that he was also struggling as an African with the cross-pollination of cultures, the entrance of Africa from a traditional society into a modern society, and that by understanding what he had gone through, I think it better prepared me to face the struggles that I'm continuing to go through.
I'm wondering if the ethnically mixed couple of today, if when their child is 34 years old, if they'll find it any easier to deal with these issues then than you have found it now.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I think in some ways there's less novelty to the idea of mixed couples. They're not seen as lurid or perverse in ways that I think they were 30 years ago. I think that this country is inevitably going to be undergoing changes simply due to demographics. I think there's been a lot of talk about the browning of America.
I was just going to use that the same phrase.
Right, and I think that is going to be happening, and we can't ignore it. I think whether or not my children or your children will have to struggle with these same issues depends on what we do, and whether we take some mutual responsibility for bridging the divisions that exist right now. And I really want to emphasize the word responsibility. I think that whether you are a white executive living out in the suburbs who doesn't want to pay taxes to inner city children for them to go to school, or you are a inner city child who doesn't want to take responsibility for keeping your streets safe and clean, both of those groups have to take some responsibility if we're going to get beyond the kinds of divisions that we face right now.